Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Pro Tips for Pilots. This evening, we're going to have the title False Sense of Security. I think you will find it interesting. I think you will find it alarming for certain people that have been out there for flying for years. And before I get started in tonight's presentation, I am going to also talk about here some of our folks that are part of this team. Troy Sekas from the Minneapolis FISDO is working the computers in the background, along with Levi Eastlick, who will be asking all the questions this evening that you are typing in. The question box, remember the chat box is not operational, so please type all your questions into the question box. If we do not get to answer that question at the end of the webinar, definitely consult with your local FISDO and flight instructors in your area. We definitely want you to get the right answers. We also have David Hintz from the Des Moines FISDO, part of this group. And of course, Steve Lastday is joining us as always. We will all be answering questions as we get to the end of the presentation. Remember, our Pro Tips webinar series are every week throughout the month, always on Wednesdays. Obviously, we start out with the Pro Tips for CFIs and students on the first. And as you can read, we do the UAS Pro Tips every other month as we can get the speakers lined up for the topics that are pertinent at the time. We currently are at 144 countries, folks watching us, 7 continents. If you are one of those countries that is not in red, please send us an email. That way we can get that done so that we can see who's joining us from where. So really appreciate your time. These are our upcoming webinars. Obviously, Laura does every Saturday morning, Coffee and Wings. It's presented at 9 a.m. And I have her highlighted in yellow. Pro Tips for Mechanics is coming up next week, Wednesday. And Troy is going to be talking about muffler systems on that. He's going to have one of our speakers. Tonight, I am super excited to have John Schmiel along with myself doing the presentation. John did this presentation at AirVenture 2025 in Oshkosh for a group of folks at the NAFI get together. And John has been teaching, like myself, for many, many years, and he has a vast amount of experience in the teaching world and has 6 flight instructors working at his FBO that are teaching from private all the way through the advanced ratings. So tonight, one thing that we are going to talk about is we want to combine knowledge and skill. And to me, we learned this through what I'm going to introduce this subject matter with in the Pilot Proficiency Center that we hold workshops at the EAA. We have 12 simulators at the EAA, and we conduct full day workshops, and I'm going to show those to you that include not only seminars but also simulator training in Redbird simulators that are stationary simulators. And we want to talk about that. This is a picture of the Pilot Proficiency Center at EAA in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. But it holds 12 Redbird simulators, non-motion, and also a crosswind simulator that is motion. And what we do there is we have a group of 4 employees at EAA that are full-time employees for the Pilot Proficiency Center. And we added 48 flight instructors from the Wisconsin area that are flight training and teaching at both the Part 91 and 141 flight schools and flight centers. Along with myself and Levi Eastlick, we run these workshops. And an example of this workshop, it's an all-day workshop that we do, is we bring in 24 pilots and we give them a FAA safety seminar that's worth one wings knowledge credit. And then we divide the group in half. We have Group A going to the simulator while Group B gets another safety seminar. And they make the switch after about an hour and 15 to an hour and 30 minutes. And so that both groups get to fly the simulator. At the afternoon session, we call it the working lunch, we actually do our third safety seminar. So that gives them the basic knowledge topic 2, and topic 3 when they attend this workshop. And if they meet the standard, they also get one flight activity credit for that. The idea here is simply when they walk out of there, we will give them the worksheets for the other 2 flight activities that they need to accomplish in order for them to get a full phase of wings. And of course, that's in lieu of a flight review. They have just finished what their requirements are is of a flight review for 24 months. That's a really neat opportunity for our local pilots to get that information and also get that training. Now, what we found that is really interesting in these workshops is, remember, we have these 48 flight instructors. We noticed that as they are going and doing the training in the sim center, it is just like walking through a school cafeteria or restaurant. It is very noisy, and we're all looking at this saying, wait a second, why is it so noisy in this sim center? It shouldn't be that way where it's noisy the entire time. So we started walking around and spending time behind each flight instructor station and noted that these flight instructors were actually not really evaluating, but they were coaching their folks through the flight activity and instructing continuously. So obviously at that point we realized we have to do something about that. So we ended up doing a Pro Tips webinar last fall that we did, which is evaluation versus teaching. And we used that for a training module for our flight instructors. And then we put them back into the simulator and we were training with them to make sure that they understood the difference between teaching and evaluating. And as John's going to talk about the differences, you're going to very quickly see, hey, are you one of those products? Are you one of those pilots out there flying for years where you've been going to these flight reviews and the instructors never stop talking? So this is not like a seminar where Yerk starts droning for an hour and having a talk. An evaluation should be a quiet time where the evaluator does what they're supposed to do. So that's really where we're going to leave off. I'm going to have John introduce himself and he's going to be taking it from there. And then we'll give you the tools at the end of this period of how you can go about it using the FAA Advisory Circular 61-98E. John, it is all yours.
Thank you, Jürgen. Thank you for giving me this great opportunity to present this evening. I feel honored because I really like watching these and learning from these and from the other experts that are on these online programs. So it's really great to be a part of it. So tonight, what I want to do, we've already given this presentation to a few flight instructors, and it seems to have had impact. But when you're a pilot, maybe you don't care so much about instruction versus evaluation. And we kind of think that you should. And the reason that we think you should is that when you're getting currency training, whether it be a flight review or an instrument proficiency check or a wings program, you have to become a partner and a team member in doing that kind of flying and flight training together. If you aren't an active participant in that, then you're not going to get as much out of it as you need to. And basically, instructors teach 90% of the time. And so it's difficult for the instructors to shut off their teaching and become an evaluator. We always want to have input. A lot of times we can see that even a little body English would improve the performance of the student. But really what we're trying to figure out is, how do you fly when we're not there? And sometimes over time, you perform really well on your check ride and you do meet the minimum standard of the FAA. But then for 2 years, you don't fly with somebody. And so now it's time for the instructor to say, okay, what has the student learned over the last 2 years that maybe makes them not meet the standard anymore? In the beginning, the flight instructor is the teacher, but after you become a pilot, experience is the teacher. So we're just trying to figure out, do you still meet the standard? Next slide, please. So, like I said before, become a partner with your flight instructor, and you will do so much better if you prepare for that event. You have to put yourself in the instructor's shoes or pilot examiner's shoes and understand that the instructor really wants you to perform well, and so does a DPE. The last thing they want to say to a pilot they're flying with is, hey, you know, this is going to take a little bit more work and we can do that now, or we can schedule a flight in the future, but we've got to get that done before I can sign you off for the flight review. So, you know, not everybody is studying over the 24 calendar months, and not everybody is practicing their maneuvers over those 24 calendar months. So just a little preparation ahead of time, knowing what's going to take place and being given the time and opportunity to practice for that, you're just going to perform so much better. That's going to make it a better event and experience for you, and it's going to make a better event and experience for the flight instructor. Next slide, please. So why is this important? Well, when we were putting this together, my 7 instructors collaborated with me putting this PowerPoint presentation together, and they came up and found this great quote that says, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And then when the student is ready, the teacher disappears. And that's what flight instructors need to work on. We need to know when it's time to teach, but then we have to know how to disappear and just evaluate. And so understand that during these kinds of events like flight reviews, wings credits, IPCs, earning endorsements, aircraft checkouts, if you're not hearing the instructor talk, you're doing fine. That should be the goal. If the instructor starts talking, that means teaching needs to take place or coaching needs to take place. And ultimately, our goal as evaluators is to not speak at all. Now, the way that you can get better at that and having those kinds of experiences is you need to start becoming your own evaluator. And that's where I would encourage you to get the latest copy of the ACS. It's available for free online. And when you understand what your flight profile is going to be, look up those maneuvers in that aeronautical or airman certification standard and figure out, how well do I have to do this maneuver? And kind of look at that ahead of time. Next slide, please. So let's just go over some definitions. The first one is, what is it? What does instruction mean? And it means to transfer knowledge to the learner. Evaluation, on the other hand, is the process of assessing or appraising a situation, system, or procedure. What we're doing is we're watching and we're evaluating whether or not that exercise is meeting the standard. Now, when you're instructing, that's typically not a time-limited situation in most cases. You can sit down, explain things, go to the chalkboard, really talk about it. The student can interact with the instructor, or the pilot can interact with the instructor, ask questions, those sorts of things. When you're in the airplane, if you're being instructed, typically the instructor is holding the controls or the instructor is talking. Now, when you're really in the heat of things, receiving instruction, a full narrative of how to do something when you're flying is actually distracting, and it can reduce your performance in front of the instructor. So at that point, we have to kind of go into a different phase, which would be the assessment phase. And there, what we're doing is we're observing what's going on, and we're only addressing the weak areas with maybe a word or two. And I would call that coaching. And coaching is to give instruction or advice in the capacity of a coach. Think of it more tactical in nature than what pure flight instruction is. Instruction is strategic, and it's not time limited, but a coach operates typically in a tactical situation or a time limited situation. Think of the football coach on the sideline as, he's yelling, go to the end zone, so that he can't sit there and explain why you need to go to the end zone. He's just telling you to get there. Next slide, please. So learning a skill really requires 3 distinct phases. And as a pilot who's being evaluated, you should understand the difference between the 3 of them. And during a flight review, really, you're trying to avoid instruction. It may be required, but if you're meeting the standard, you're probably not getting instructed while you're on the flight deck flying the airplane. Now, if you don't meet the standard, then coaching may need to take place. But I think it's important that the flight instructor put their coach hat on at that point and say, hey, look, I'm not going to instruct you here, but I am going to coach you through this to see if we can do it better. And then, of course, when you get to the evaluation stage, it's important that the flight instructor say to the pilot, all right, look, I'm keeping my mouth shut. I'm not touching anything. This is all on you. Show me that you can meet the standard. Next slide, please. So let's delve a little deeper into evaluation. So evaluation is actually the final stage of the teaching process. And the reason we're going over that first here is if you're a pilot already, really, you probably aren't and shouldn't be being instructed during a flight review. And the way that the instructor can see what level you're at is he's going to, or she is going to ask you some questions after you do a maneuver. And, typically what I'll do with a flight student is I'll say, how do you think you did on that steep turn? Okay. And let's be honest. As pilots, when we're flying, we make mistakes. We make mistakes on every flight. All we are is mistake managers. And it is our job to find those mistakes and fix them before somebody else sees it, in this case, the evaluator or a passenger. And it's also kind of important to avoid those mistakes taking us and bending metal or hurting us. And so you need to understand what is a mistake and what's not. So when we ask you, how did you do? We're expecting you to say, yep, I lost more altitude than I wanted to on that steep turn. And if we hear that from you, inside of us, we're going, yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. But then the next question out of our mouth is going to be, how are you going to fix that mistake on this next try? And then we want to hear you say things like, well, I wasn't looking in the right place. I need to look out the front of the airplane and make sure I put the cowling in the right position on the horizon. And if I do that, then I'm going to fix the mistake. If you say, boy, I don't know how to fix that mistake, now the instructor has some work to do, and there may be instruction that needs to take place because they have to tell you how you can fix that mistake. So just remember that if the CFI is quiet, it does not interfere, you're doing pretty darn good. The CFI is only observing, and the student is doing all the talking and touching on the controls during the evaluation. Next slide, please. We're kind of doing this in reverse order. And the reason we're doing that is, let's say we blow our steep turn during the flight review, okay? At this point, the instructor may not go back to the drawing board and try to teach you all over again how to narrate the process while he demonstrates how to do a steep turn. The instructor at that point really would like to just address the weak area that caused the mistake on your steep turn. And so that's what occurs in the assessing phase. It's not strategic in nature. We're not trying to say, we're not trying to talk you through it. It's something that I call the instructor flying through the student, which is something that I see a lot on social media videos of instructors helping students learn things. I see a lot of flight instructors just completely narrating and flying through the student without touching the controls. In the assessing phase, that's not what happens. In the assessing phase, the instructor's only teaching when necessary. The student is expected to move the controls, maybe even talk themselves through it. And when the mistake occurs, the instructor, if the student doesn't identify it, the instructor will, and then we'll give maybe one word or small hints, or maybe tap the elevator control, or maybe give a little body English to show the student, hey, they need to be doing something about this mistake that was just found. And during this whole assessing phase, which may require 2 or 3 attempts at improving the maneuver, during that assessment phase, the coach or the flight instructor should be talking less and less, or touching the controls less and less. In the assessing phase, the CFI might be touching the controls if they're trying to show you something. All right, next slide, please. So the key differences between assessing and evaluating. Now, the assessment phase is about learning and improvement, okay? But remember that during the coaching phase or the assessment phase, the CFI is still evaluating, but what they're hoping is that the student is evaluating at the same time, that you already know the mistake that you're making and you're attempting to fix it. Because if we can get you to the level where you can identify your mistake, now we know that the only thing you have to do is fix the mistake. So that's what the assessment phase is for. Are you recognizing the mistake and then applying the proper process to improve? So during that, and before we get to the evaluation phase, that's what we're looking for. Tell us what you're doing wrong. Tell us what you're going to fix. If I'm doing steep turns and I see somebody exceed 100 feet, but they say to me, I'm losing altitude, my rivet line on the cowl is too low below the horizon, and I watch them do the right control inputs to fix that, we've made huge progress. And the next time we do that, when we evaluate it, I know I'm probably not going to have to say anything. Next slide, please. Yep, I think we went through all of that. Next slide. All right, more stuff on assessing and evaluating. Next click there, Jörg. So evaluation is really about judging end results. What we're doing is we are looking at the end product. Next bullet point there. So here, the student should be telling us what they're doing wrong. And listen, you're doing something wrong most of the time on every flight. So as soon as you begin to see it, you just need to tell us and show us that you're trying to fix it. Next bullet. All right, and in the evaluation stage, the instructor's really doing their best job to keep their mouth shut, because once you tell us what's wrong, we're really hoping that you go on and show us how to fix that without us saying anything. Otherwise, we're right back into the coaching. Next slide, please. Oh, on that last bullet point, the student's critique should match the evaluator. That is important. But if there's any instructors listening tonight, I think it's important that we listen to what the student says, because if they point out a mistake that's different than the one we intend to tell them about, we should maybe evaluate whether that's also contributing to the problem. So it has to be good communication between the two, and we need to fully listen to the person that we're trying to evaluate. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about instructing. And I really hesitated putting this particular slide into the presentation, but I decided that it still was important because, in my opinion, if you're teaming up with your instructor and you're properly preparing for a flight review, there could be some opportunity there to learn something new. And in those cases, you're going to end up instructing, okay, or receiving instruction. And I think that's important. I can tell you that my office is adjacent to my instructor's offices. And one of the things that I notice is the students that are the best are the ones that come in and ask the questions and do all the talking. And then I can hear the instructors responding to them. The students and pilots that do the worst are the ones that I never hear talking, and all I hear is the instructor talking. And I think sometimes when you become an instructor, you worked so hard to talk and fly at the same time so that you would pass the check ride that you don't understand that we have to know when to instruct and when not to instruct. And so a lot of instructors are always in instructing mode. And so be careful of that. But when you're learning a new skill, it's about transferring knowledge to the student. So teaching it obviously is done in the instructing phase. And when you're instructing, you're typically filling in details that the pilot's unaware of. So how would instructing be important on an evaluation? When you get done with the profiles that you talked about, you may say to the instructor, I really, when you're doing the interview, at the end, you might say, I'd really like to learn this new skill. And let's say it's you want to learn how to do steep spirals or a commercial maneuver. We don't even have to pick one. Then the instructor can give you some advice. Hey, if we're going to do that on the flight review, if we have time, I want you to look in this ACS and I want you to look on these pages in the airplane flying handbook. And I think that's really important because reading is more effective in transferring knowledge to a student than, say, a lecture is, like I'm talking to you tonight. When you hear things that you agree with, you may remember that after this presentation tonight. But if some of those things don't ring true, you may not remember them even tomorrow or next week. But if you were to read about the subject or watch a video on the subject, or if you were to try practicing teaching this subject to somebody else tomorrow, you will retain that knowledge a lot better. And that's a lot more effective than tribal knowledge or something where I might, in the flight deck, try and teach you a lazy 8 through tribal knowledge without preparing you for it or having you prepare for it ahead of time. All right, instruction and assessment differences. When we were putting this together, one of my instructors, Braden Dalkey, my name shouldn't even be on this graph. He's the guy that put this together. But to give you an idea of what we're talking about in graph form, on the left-hand side, you see the instructor involvement on the vertical scale, and you see student involvement on the lower scale. So when we're instructing, the instructor's very active. We're talking, we're narrating, we're assessing, we're teaching you and encouraging you to do certain things certain ways. So we're really active and our throats get dry because we're talking too much. In the assessment phase, we're trying to talk less and touch the airplane less. And you can see that curves down. And when we get to the evaluation stage, now the student is very active and the instructor is kind of hiding what they're doing at that point, okay? And ultimately, the goal is we want to get on the lower end of that curve with high student involvement and low instructor involvement. Next slide, please. Now, what you have to understand and what we're hoping is that your CFI is automatically doing these things in his head, but you as the pilot or the student really don't understand what phase you're in because it's not being clearly announced to you. So I think that a flight review would go a lot better for both parties if they could decide, okay, I have the flight controls. I am now instructing you. So listen to what I have to say. A lot of times, instructors will do this so that the pilot doesn't have to worry about flying the airplane and they can give 100% attention to the flight instructor so that they can get their point across. So it's real easy to tie identifying the phase of flight you're in to a positive exchange of flight controls. Because when I'm instructing, I'm probably touching the controls and I'm probably talking. So just say to the pilot, hey, if I got the flight controls and I'm talking, we're instructing here. When I hand off the controls to the pilot after I've done my instructing, then as the evaluator, I need to make it clear. Are you in the coaching phase now? Or are you in the evaluation phase now? Because if I announce I'm evaluating you now, as the pilot, you should understand that if I don't say anything and I don't do anything and I don't touch anything, it is likely that you are doing things well enough, that you're being evaluated. And that should be the goal. So let's talk a little bit here about evaluation techniques. So just remember that it should be your goal as the pilot. If the instructor says to you, how well do you think you did? You need at that point to confess all of your sins. Don't make sins up. Just identify what you think you did wrong. And I'll ask my pilots how well they did, even though I know they passed, because I want to hear, well, I lost 50 feet on that. And that makes me know that they're keeping their scan up, that their OODA loop is flowing, and they are identifying and using the performance instruments to see if they're well within the standard. But if they make a mistake, I want to make sure it matches what I saw. So the easiest way to do that is just review the ACS once in a while, but especially before you're going to get evaluated. Now, one of the best pieces of advice that I received was from my friend Keith Myers, who's a DPE here in Wisconsin. And he said, what's really important, not only that you should use no words or hints or body language when you're an evaluator, but you should have a poker face. Don't pass anything on to the pilot while they're being evaluated that could give them a hint of their performance. Because what we're really trying to figure out here is, how does this pilot fly when I'm not there? And then once we find those things, now it's up to us to communicate further. Next slide, please. So what we want you to do is to take accountability, okay? And understand that when you have a deficiency, it's typically an amplification of your first instructor's inability to teach that subject. Now, that doesn't mean that flight instructor is a bad instructor, but it does mean that maybe some poor communication took place on that subject when you were learning. Or maybe you just haven't done that for a long time and you're really rusty on that maneuver or on that subject. And this is why we do flight reviews, because the evaluator is to figure out where the weaknesses are and just address those. If we're instructing all the time, then the weak areas that we're also instructing on gets lost in everything. So what we really only want to do is talk about the weak areas and fix the weak areas. Everything else that meets the standard, we're good with. So you have to take ownership of the flight as the pilot. Next slide, please. All right, okay, good. So in conclusion, what we would like to see moving on into the future is pilots taking a completely different mindset when they know they're going to have to fly with the flight instructor. And I was talking to my good friend Bob Moore today. We've known each other and flown together over the last 33 years, and we were discussing the subject. And he said, I used to go on flight reviews or wings programs, and I used to really dread uh, going on these flights. And I would be so focused on my performance that I wouldn't fly the way I do when that evaluator wasn't there. I was looking at instruments more than I did typically when I flew. And I wasn't showing that evaluator the way that I fly. And he said, once I figured out that, hey, the evaluator just wants to see how I fly and address the weak areas, then he came to the flight reviews with a whole different mindset and said to himself, yeah, I can't wait to go flying with the flight instructor tomorrow because I want to see what my weak areas are and try to figure out how to fix them. Because let's face it, folks, as pilots, we're always doing our best to have the best flight that we can have. And if we knew we were making mistakes, we would try to fix them. Okay. And when you're with a flight instructor all the time, it's pretty easy to identify the mistakes. But if we haven't flown with another instructor or another pilot for the last 24 calendar months, remember that learning is a change in behavior based on experience. And the flying experiences that you've had over that 24 months, those experiences may have taught you ways to do things in the airplane that aren't safe or don't allow you to meet the minimum standard that the FAA wants you to have. And that's what the flight instructor's job is. It's not that the instructor is angry because you pull the power out before you pull the carburetor heat out, and they'd like to see it the other way. That's kind of a technique thing. And flight instructors really shouldn't argue about technique unless the technique that you're using isn't working for you. Then it's the flight instructor's job to say, hey, looks like that technique's not working. Let's try this and see if it helps bring you up to standard. Okay. Just do things the way that you do and don't worry about being evaluated. You're probably going to make mistakes. That's not the end of the world. But if the evaluator knows that you see the same mistakes that they do and you know how to fix them, and then you can show that you can do it, it's going to make that flight review easy peasy. So just take full ownership of the flight review before the flight, during the flight, after the flight, and before you do the ground stuff. And I think that's about all I've got.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. And I'm going to continue, and then we will be doing questions and answers at the end. You know, the number one reason why we're doing this presentation tonight is, simply put, accidents and incidents continue to occur, and a number of them are attributed to lack of proficiency and standard operating procedures or practices. And really what John and I are really hammering on is simply this. How can somebody that just finished a flight review 2 weeks later be in an aircraft accident where they lost control of the aircraft because they had a 5-knot direct crosswind on that runway, and they were not able to maintain the aircraft on the center line? That really says a lot to us, and it says that, hey, obviously the evaluation at the time probably was not where it needed to be. Or let's play devil's advocate. What if the winds were calm that day of a flight review? We always have to look at the circumstances, but the number one thing that we are constantly looking at is how can we make it better and how can we improve safety? And that's why we're here tonight. So we know that proficiency training can be fun, and flight reviews are part of that. We have to understand the process, and we have to be comfortable with the flight review process. And with that, I'm going to give you the FAA's help with the Advisor Circular AC 6198E. Most of us are very familiar with that AC simply because it gives us the guidelines of how to administer a proper flight review. And this is something that every pilot should be familiar with where they can do their homework prior to meeting with their instructor and determining which instructor they're going to be using for that flight review, because that's just as important that we find someone that is very obviously professional and does a really good job doing a very objective flight review. So we're going to talk about that. And, I'm not a big fan of flight reviews, honestly. I think there are better programs out there, but that's not our topic tonight. I believe that the FAA Wings program, where we're continuously doing a small portion of a flight review through the flight activities, is a much more efficient way to maintain currency throughout the 24 calendar months. And we will be talking about that later on in another webinar. But obviously, an effective evaluation does have these qualities. And to me, that goes for both of us, whether you are the pilot or the flight instructor. Being organized always entails a written plan of action. And most of us who have been instructing for years, we still use it. Why? Because as people, we always forget certain things that afterwards we're like, oh, shoot, I didn't do a soft field landing. Oh, shoot, I didn't ask for them to do a crosswind um, takeoff as an example. So to me, again, think of a DP during a check ride. That's really what your flight instructor should be acting as when you did your initial, whether private pilot, instrument rating, commercial pilot. Those were all practical check rides that you did where you actually had to meet the ACS standards. And so that is the big thing that I think is lacking oftentimes in the flight reviews that we see out there. So how do we go about it? Well, simply put, you get to your laptop or your computer, you log into FAA.gov, you hover your mouse over regulations, you click on ACs, and then you type in flight reviews, and you're there. That is exactly how you'll get to your Advisory Circular 6198E. Now, what I'm concentrating on is Appendix D. If it was me, I would print out that page and I would review that page simply because that's what you're going to do as a pilot to get ready for that flight review. A flight review will only go as well as you being prepared for it. And obviously, there are 5 steps that we're going to be talking about in a flight review. And they obviously entail that pre-flight review actions. We're going to talk about ground discussion. We're going to talk about the flight discussion. And just as important, the post-flight discussion. And I added that 5th one, aeronautical health and maintenance. In other words, what are you going to do for the next 24 months so that you won't fall into that fallacy that, oh, I'm good enough to go, no worries, nothing to worry about. And that's where that false sense of security is part of it. Remember, the interview goes both ways. When you are a flight instructor, this is what you're supposed to do when you don't know your pilot that you're going to do a flight review for, is you want to know what the pilot's ratings are. The pilot definitely wants to tell you about their experience, the type of aircraft. This is a big one for you to be talking to the flight instructor. Let's say your flight instructor is a new flight instructor in the industry and you own a Beechcraft Bonanza as an example. That's a lot of airplane. That is a very complex airplane, and depending how you have it set up, it could have a very difficult fuel system that you only understand and the instructor is clueless about, that it has 6 fuel tanks on it, that it's a long-range aircraft. You might have a very fancy avionics suite in that airplane. Wow, that's a lot to bite off for a flight instructor. And to me, you want to seek out the most qualified flight instructor that's not only current, but also is proficient in flying that aircraft. And sometimes it's taking your time and talking to other people, talking to type clubs to find that instructor because that is huge, not only in the quality of the evaluation that you're going to get, but also the safety aspect, which is the most important part of it. You do want to talk to the instructor and tell them about your experience. Are you a day VFR pilot? Do you fly cross countries? Do you use the aircraft for business? Um, do you have some certain experience that you did not like in the last 24 months that you want to gain some more experience on? And definitely talk about it. Definitely do some of that in your training and in your evaluation on that flight review. And like I said, type of flying. There's a huge difference between someone that flies for business and someone that flies for pleasure because obviously you're motivated to go from A to B when you are on a business trip versus, hey, I have lots of leeway. I only fly on beautiful blue sky days and I take my time when I'm flying across the country. And of course, taking a personal assessment is incredibly important. As we age as pilots, that's a really big one for all of us to take a look at. Am I as sharp at today as I was 15 years ago? Well, if you're like me, probably not so much. It's probably going to take you longer, and you're going to have to work harder at maintaining proficiency and safety. Now, knowledge portion, that's really easy. You're gonna have to be doing a regulatory review. I know not too many of you like to look at the regulations. That's very dry material. But on the other hand, it is important that, hey, in order for me to get out of this airport, I'm going to have to ask for a special VFR. Does that make sense today? Probably not, or probably yes, because the front is just about to move through and you know you're good to go. It probably wouldn't be a real good idea in a congested area. So you need to know what a congested area is. What do you need for cloud clearance? What do you need for obstruction clearance? And of course, weather and weather decision making. Risk management is everything in our airman certification standards. That's why they were rewritten, because we really want to assess your risk management and how you do that. Personal minimums. Your instructor better be asking you about your personal minimums, and they are never solid. They do not stay the same. I haven't flown for 3 months. My personal minimums should be higher than if I flew last week because I just flew 12 hours in the last 2 weeks. So my personal minimums can change. And of course, general aviation security issues are part of it. So when you do go into the flight portion of activities, we talk about different kinds of things that we are looking at. Obviously, basic stick skills. And basic stick skills are a perishable item. And that means, hey, when's the last time you actually went out and got some dual instruction? This is one thing that I talk about all the time in my safety seminars. And I say that we as pilots are penny wise and dollar foolish in the context we are extremely cheap about getting training, but we have no problem adding a new system to our aircraft. And the reality of it is, the accidents that I look at continuously, I can tell you over and over again, they're usually due to lack of basic skills and, of course, lack of proficiency as a whole, whether it's knowledge or stick skills. So if you're going to spend money in aviation, spend it on your training. This is my big talk for CFIs. We need to go see them more than just for a flight review. The folks that are taking continuous training, the folks that are doing flight activities through FAA Wings program and attending safety seminars, they are not the folks that I see on my accident statistics. And that says a lot. I've been doing this for 15 years now, and I can tell you over and over again, it's huge. mental airplane automation and aircraft systems. It's something we as pilots have a really tough time with because we're not reading the supplemental portions of the POH. If you have an autopilot in your aircraft, do you know how to test that autopilot? Do you know how to turn it off? Not just with the switch on the yoke, but do you know where the circuit breaker is? Those are things that are extremely important for you to really have down. Aircraft system knowledge is another one. Do you understand your fuel system? Do you understand uh, your V speeds, your limitations on the aircraft? Or are you one of those people that goes out there and flies the airplane and at times exceeds the limitations on that aircraft? And of course, here we go again. Everybody gave me a hard time last year because I talked about stabilized approaches to landings. You are not going to get a good landing unless you had a stabilized approach. That is a must. It doesn't matter what type of airplane you fly, that is where you need to work on it. 70% of our accidents in Wisconsin in the last year were due to unstabilized approaches to landings. So if you're going to spend some time training, this is the area that is definitely the weakest that we're seeing in pilots. Slow flight. Don't get me started on that one. I believe in minimum controllable airspeed is a wonderful training tool where the pilot actually learns to fly behind that power curve because, man, does that airplane ever get sloppy at minimum controllable airspeed. I believe that slow flight by definition is anything I want to make it. Slowing the airplane down, I believe that minimum controllable airspeed is a great, great training tool to really show the pilot what this airplane is doing when it's behind that power curve in minimum control airspeed. Stalls recovery, spin recognition. Have you ever spun an airplane? Have you ever had training in that? I hope that it was during training and not inadvertent. I can tell you that I have 7 DPs in the state of Wisconsin, and 2 of them in the last 12 months ended up in a spin scenario with doing a check ride. Not a good situation. In other words, we definitely want to maintain currency on that. And of course, recovery from unusual attitudes. That's actually required in a flight review. Now, my question to you is, when you're talking about recovery from an unusual attitude, when's the last time you were actually under the hood? When's the last time you actually flew in instrument flight conditions with a flight instructor where you filed IFR, even though you don't have an instrument rating, but you went out there and you want to experience flying through a broken layer of clouds to get the feel for what that really is if you inadvertently got into the clouds while you're out there flying visually. Very, very great training tool, doing it safely with your instructor. And that's what we're talking about, operating the aircraft by sole reference to instruments. And aeronautical decision making. Again, we make good decisions when we understand our material, when we have good knowledge, and that is through studying, and it costs us nothing but our time. That's something that, again, people really need to acknowledge is taking their time and studying that POH periodically. And of course, automation system failures brings us right back up to the mental airplane automation. Huge deal. Emergencies and abnormals. I believe that training these in a simulator is a wonderful way to do it because you can do it safely and repetitively until you get really good at it. Now, you finished up your flight review, you shut the airplane down, you did your walk around the airplane, you go back into the office with your instructor, and now it's time to replay what the flight review was all about, what went well, what didn't go so well. And I believe that this should be done and led by you, the pilot, because to me, that also tells the instructor where you're really at. Are you at one of those pilots that, well, it's good enough, I just want that sign off and move on? Or are you one of those pilots that really wants to get better? And being and understanding the parameters of these maneuvers is obviously a must. How can you judge yourself if you don't know what the rules are? We want to reconstruct it, and of course, we want to redirect and get the questions answered. You, the pilot, evaluate your performance before the CFI starts their debrief. And obviously, then they do their talk. Now, having said so, aeronautical health maintenance and improvement plan. We all want to get better at what we do. And I don't care if you have a student pilot certificate or an airline transport pilot certificate, professional professionalism comes into place for all of us. We want to be the best we can be. Why? Because that's how we end up being the safer pilot out there. And to me, we love the Wings program simply because if you look at the basic flight activities for Wings, it is nothing but a flight review in thirds. And instead of you doing an entire flight review in one sitting where you're out there flying, you can actually divide that into 3 separate flight activities where you must perform the maneuvers to the level of certificate you have, no different than a flight review. And that's where people again ask me, hey, do I need to have a CFI along? Absolutely, because they're the ones who are going to evaluate if you're doing that. So those are huge. Now, on the knowledge portion, you're doing it tonight. You are getting the information via webinar. It's a wonderful way to get you that information. But remember what John pointed out with the pyramid. Me droning on for 50 minutes is going to give you very little information that you're going to retain versus you teaching it to someone else. So just because you don't have a CFI under your belt, treat it as you being the CFI. If you can teach a friend how to do a steep turn, explaining it to them, and being able to talk through that maneuver, most likely you'll not have a problem doing that in the aircraft. Teaching is an incredibly important way for us to go with that. And as I said to you folks, the FAA Wings program is a wonderful program that really outlines a flight review. So next time, if you get anything out of my presentation before you get into a flight review, go and grab yourself FAA Air Advisory Circular 6198E. If you do that, I guarantee you that it's going to end up to be an excellent flight review where everybody walks away smiling.